Hello, everyone. Welcome to this tribute to human rights champion Paul Dewar. Paul Dewar was a dear friend of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We worked with him on several crucial human rights issues, and we've always considered Paul as a human rights champion in Canada. Today, I'm very delighted to welcome Alex Neve, Hélène Laverdiere, Tom Mulcair, and Roméo Dallaire. They all worked with Paul on crucial human rights issues in Canada. And we are at a special time, I think, globally in terms of human rights. We're seeing human rights being trampled in China, in Myanmar recently, and in Russia. And I think if Paul were here today, he would have done a lot of work to do some crucial advocacy work in Canada and abroad. So today, I think we all want to pay tribute to Paul. We also want to thank his family for watching this event, perhaps. And we would all want to say a few words. So perhaps, Alex, you want to start and say a few things about Paul? Thank you.
Thanks so very much, Marie, and hello, everyone. I'm joining you today, morning time for me, in unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory here in Ottawa. Paul Dewar was and still is so many things to me and in my life. First, I happen to live in Ottawa Centre. That's actually where I am today. So for 9 years, Paul Dewar was my MP. And he was a very fine one at that. Not surprisingly, of course, because Paul was a man very much from and of community, and therefore being a responsive and engaged MP came to him so very naturally. Second, certainly this is what brings us together in many respects, he was a fierce human rights champion. I always remember how very soon after he was first elected to the House in 2006, he phoned me at Amnesty International. We had not met before then, but it was a top priority for him to let me know that he was in the House. And I still remember his words. He said he intended to be an MP for human rights. Well, once I had caught my breath, we set a coffee date for soon after that, and really a tremendous partnership and friendship took flight. And let me tell you, I did not get many of those sorts of calls from newly elected MPs over my 20 years at Amnesty. I intend to be an MP for human rights. But it wasn't just words, because that's very much who he was, unfailingly and in the truest sense of what it is to believe in human rights, because for him, it was never about scoring political points, not in the slightest. It was all about the fact that we all, including him, have a shared and very precious responsibility to uphold and defend human rights at every turn. Third, Paul was a man of such enormous compassion and solidarity. I cannot recall the number of times I came to him to share concerns about cases of Canadians imprisoned abroad, of family members here in Canada distressed about the fate of their loved ones, perhaps to seek a meeting with a visiting and frequently at-risk frontline human rights defender from some far-flung corner of the world, or to make an introduction to a young activist filled with energy and determination to forge a better world. And Paul always had the time, made the time, shared the time. Quite frankly, I don't know where he found the time. And his concern and attention was not limited to his riding and his constituents, tempting as that probably often would have been just for time management purposes. But he was the human rights MP after all, so he really had time and space seemingly for one and all. And in some of our most demanding common advocacy, in fact, there was no connection to Ottawa Centre at all. Just as one example among so very many, Paul gave an enormous amount to the effort to free a man named Bashir Maktal from unjust imprisonment in Ethiopia. Bashir was cruelly imprisoned there for 11 years. And at so many points, it was so very difficult to generate public awareness and keep up the pressure for strong Canadian government action to free him. Neither Bashir nor his family had any connection to Paul's writing, but he became one of the most steadfast voices in pressing for his freedom, raising it in the House, putting demands directly to various ministers, always having time to meet with Bashir's devoted cousin when he was in Ottawa. So no surprise at all that when Bashir was at long last freed in April of 2018, and soon after came to Ottawa for meetings and a press conference, Paul was at the very top of the list of people who Bashir wanted to meet and thanks. And it was not at all limited to the easy cases. I will always be grateful for Paul's strong voice in championing the cases of many Canadians who had been ensnared in and experienced horrific human rights violations during the grim days of the so-called War on Terror, and for pressing hard for a change in Canada's approach to battlefield detainees in Afghanistan. That said so much about what human rights was all about. For Paul, it wasn't just about the easy battles. It was about standing firm and strong for human rights no matter what. Fourth, he was a man of action and progress. How easily we all feel beleaguered and overwhelmed in the face of enormous roadblocks to advancing rights and justice. Yet Paul always offered the next step forward. He was always focused on progress, always looking ahead, always thinking concretely. Grave human rights violations in our world do not relent, and the means to end such unspeakable tragedies so often seem far beyond reach. So in Paul's mind, what about an all-parliamentary group for preventing genocide and crimes against humanity? That needs to be established. And how he devoted heart and soul to advancing efforts across party lines to prevent and address mass atrocities the world over. And so often behind the atrocities, fueling the atrocities, unbridled trade in conflict minerals. So here's the private members legislation I will table. Here's the campaign we need to embark on, the partnerships that need to be forged, the frontline voices that need to be lifted up. Here's the workshop, the conference, the roundtable we need to organize to bring everyone together and to generate momentum. Fifth, Paul was a hockey dad. And many of my warmest memories of Paul, in fact, are rinkside. I don't remember the exact years, but I so very much remember the wonderful conversations in various chilly arenas across Ottawa. Our sons were actually on opposing teams, so it was only occasionally that a game would bring us together. And then throw into the mix that for a year or two at that time, as I recall, Paul's son and Stephen Harper's son were on the same team, adding one more hockey dad into the mix. But that part of the story is for another time. But in those rinks, the advocacy, the strategizing, and the politics all gave way to the personal. Talking hockey, talking weather, and very much talking fatherhood. It was talking heart to heart, talking soul to soul. And then finally, the last thing I wanted us all to remember, of course, is that Paul was a man of such eloquence and inspiration. Earlier this morning, his poignant, thoughtful, and exceptionally generous farewell message of 2 years ago showed up as my Facebook memory. I read through it with a tender heart, just as I did on February the 6th, 2019, knowing that seeing his message meant that he had left us. And this morning, I was perhaps able to savor and relish his beautiful words even more deeply than I had at the time. So much love of life, so much celebration, so much encouragement. And here's the passage that this morning has stayed with me most profoundly. Paul's advice to us all about how to find hope and opportunity in a daunting world full of enormous challenges and seemingly insurmountable barriers. Paul said, "The secret is not to focus on how to solve the problem, but to concentrate on what you can contribute to your country, your community, your neighbors." That feels like such a mantra for these times. Just think about the world out there, the mounting climate crisis, the urgency of addressing systemic racism, the failure to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the vast inequities, global and close to home, laid bare by COVID, the relentless march of the politics of hate, fear, demonization, and lies, and the many corners of our world where repression and mass human rights abuses take their toll. Certainly today, we all hold close to our hearts the coup in Myanmar, the brutal crackdown against Uyghurs in China, the agony of the deepening humanitarian and human rights tragedy in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, the widespread clampdown on free expression in Russia, to name only a few. Paul's sage words point us in the right direction. Not that we somehow need to each have all of the answers and feel that we should and can personally and directly solve those problems, but that we have an important contribution to make, and certainly the power to make a difference, large and small, in the spotlight or behind the scenes, on our own or joining with legions of others. All of us can contribute. All of us can draw upon and celebrate the contributions of others, as Paul did every turn, and 2 years on, still so very much does. Thanks for the opportunity to share those thoughts.
Thank you so much, Alex, for those very kind words. And I think we'll speak a little bit later about the legacy of Paul Dewar. Tom, as the former leader of the NDP, I'm sure you worked with Paul on many human rights issues and others. Perhaps we can go to you next.
Thank you very much, Marie, and I want to thank you and Kyle Matthews and the Migs for organizing this event. I understand that there are a lot of friends and indeed family of Paul Dewar with us here today, and it's a fitting occasion for us to remember somebody who, in everything he did in politics, had that vision of what he could accomplish, what he could add to get to the result. So I believe that Alex has just done an outstanding job of running through the key issues that Paul has looked at. I will talk about a couple of concrete human rights issues that he's touched on. But mostly I want to talk about Paul Dewar as a friend, a colleague, and what it was like to be beside him and to deal with some of these complex issues, both when Jack Layton was leader, and that's when I got to know Paul at the beginning, and then when I became leader. I have to say quickly that knowing that we're now on our fourth foreign affairs minister in 4 years, more than ever, I regret that the dynamic duo of Paul Dewar and Hélène Laverdiere isn't there on the beat of foreign affairs, human rights, and international development for Canada. But perhaps others who will follow in their footsteps will be there another day, and that type of generous vision of what we can indeed accomplish together will prevail. I'll start off by talking about something that probably a lot of people have forgotten. Maybe not in Ottawa, but most of the people who know Paul probably forget that his attempts at elected office federally began with a race against a newcomer named Ed Broadbent. Jack Layton was the leader. There was an opening in Ottawa, and Jack had prevailed upon Ed Broadbent to present him to run in the nomination meeting and give a hand to the new leader and to bring his depth of experience and vision to the enterprise. Everybody, including all the powers that be in the party, thought that was a done deal. They didn't count on somebody with strength, determination, and a lot to say named Paul Dewar. Paul knew that the party had rules that meant that there would have to be an open contest, and he threw his hat in the ring. Powers that be being the powers that be. The result was that Ed Broadbent, of course, was given that last turn around the track for and on behalf of the party that he had worked so hard for over many years. But Paul Dewar really struck a chord with so many people in the base of the New Democratic Party of Canada and with the powers that be. So when it came to pass that Ed decided that he wasn't going to run in the next election, lo and behold, the candidate for the NDP was the same Paul Dewar. Now, that was one thing to become the candidate. It was quite another thing to win in Ottawa Centre, and he went on to do just that in the next general election and win several more times. That's an indication of somebody who is close to his community. And I think that his base was always his family, first and foremost. I got a chuckle when I heard Alex Neve talk before about his being a hockey dad at the same time with Stephen Harper and his son. I can tell you a story of one day in the house. I was sitting there and I was gobsmacked to see my friend and colleague and fellow warrior Paul Dewar walk over to Stephen Harper and start chatting and take some pictures out of his pocket and smiling the whole time. And I looked at Dewar when he came back, and I, with in my eyes, really told the tale. What was that about? How come you're talking to him with a big smile? And he goes, Tom, sometimes a hockey dad is just a hockey dad. And I think that there was a lot in that one instance that said about the happy warrior that was Paul Dewar. Paul was also my adversary in the leadership race to succeed Jack Layton when he passed away in 2011. And I have to say that Paul was the consummate gentleman. He brought nothing but ideas, never a personal criticism, never a shot against the other candidates. And it was delightful to watch him roll out. I mean, he had explained very openly the struggles that it had been for him to master his French. And everybody was hanging on all of his ideas and not any paucity in his second language. It was those ideas that always drove him forward. The profound belief that we can make a difference, that we can help other human beings. It was inspiring to watch him do his work over the years. And I have to tell you that when he would be in caucus, it was never about him. That might seem obvious because if you know Paul, you'd know that that's the way he'd operate. But caucus is very often a place where people strut their own stuff. They take their single issue very seriously and they push it forward and almost push it upon other people. Paul was always looking to build bridges. He wanted allies. He wanted people to see that they could also help accomplish something. That was the beauty of Paul Dewar's approach with his friends and his colleagues in caucus, and it carried over. As Alex mentioned, he was always reaching out to people in other parties, knowing that if we got the full weight of the Canadian Parliament, not just one party pushing in one direction on an important human rights issue, that we'd be able to have much better chances of getting to a result. That's the Paul Dewar that I regret very much no longer having in politics. I know his family and his friends will always miss him. It has been a couple of years, and Catherine and I were there for that moving ceremony in Ottawa, where you learned through the indications and the speeches and the stories that were told by the people closest to him, the depth of the character of the human being. He'll be sadly missed, and he still is and always will be, but I think that something will always remain in the New Democratic Party of that beautiful vision that he always had. Now, I said that I was going to mention a couple of the more specific things that I had a chance to work on with him, and I guess that in a party that's very progressive, a member of the Socialist International, after all, like the NDP, there would be some issues that would be more complicated than others to deal with. The relation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, of course, would be very high on that list. Paul was amazing. He had an innate sense of the difficulty of that issue for some members of caucus who were pushing for a more strident view on the one hand, but he always held back, and he held to one thing, which was the party's well thought out policy that he had a lot to do with crafting. And he would always remind people that was the party's view. So if people would throw a very loaded phrase like Israeli apartheid on it, he would always recoil from that and say, that's not our policy. Here's our policy. And he would explain it. It was working with partners for justice and peace in the Middle East. And it was well constructed. And Paul adhered to that. It's not that he was adhering blindly to something that he didn't agree with. He had helped write it. But he also knew that it had to be exemplary of how you had to build bridges in that most complicated of all files if you were going to be able to get anything done. And it was exemplary of the man. The file where I first met him, the issue that I had dealt with in the very first time that I met him, was a speech that Jack was giving at the University of Montreal on our position with regard to Afghanistan. And it was a very complex thing. It was very easy at the time. It was the beginning of some of the modes of social media that we've become familiar with today. And it was easy to caricature it. And I remember Jack Layton being called Taliban Jack because he had dared suggest that it was essential at some point to sit down and include the Taliban in peace discussions. You couldn't pretend that they weren't there. No small irony, about a year ago when I saw that the administration in the United States has come to the exact same conclusion, an administration that, of course, was admired by the people who were doing the mocking in Ottawa, the Conservative Party at the time. I think that that's also an example of vision, determination, and a deep understanding of the role of parliamentarians, elected officials, in helping get to the finish line. Alex comes from a group that's so highly respected in the work that it's done. All of these forces have to work together to achieve one thing. The only thing that matters is the result. So yes, there are huge human rights challenges in the world right now. There are horrors being perpetrated. The case of Myanmar is the most recent case in point, but of course, we know what was happening to the Rohingyas, and Canada did play a decent role in that. But there's so much more that needs to be done and that can be done, and I do believe that the inspirational leadership in that file for many years by Paul Dewar is going to carry on. A lot of that message will have been retained by people who continue to work on these files, and we're lucky to have had Paul Dewar in the NDP, but of course in the Parliament of Canada and in this issue, on these key issues in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Kyle Matthews here. I apologies that you lost me at the start of the event. My Wi-Fi went out just as we were about to start, so glad, but I was able to follow, Tom, your comments on YouTube as well as yours, Alex's. Now I would like to pass the floor to Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire. John Dallaire, who's a distinguished senior fellow at Migs, was the founder of the All-Canadian Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity that Paul served as twice as a chair. So I think no one else can speak from background in the Senate and from working with parliamentarians about human rights better than John Dallaire. John Dallaire, the floor is all yours.
Kyle, thank you very much, and well done indeed, Alex and Tom, for the fine descriptions of an absolutely extraordinary human being, young, dynamic, forceful, courageous, and incredibly loyal to the causes he took up and to the efforts that he put to it. I want to start by, if I may, by saying that even though in command I have lost troops in battle and fighting, and how difficult that is to a commander who's given the orders of going to that, I find it often more difficult to be able to come to grips and to even mourn in a level of spirituality when one of your real solid contributors, one of your loyal, committed troops is taken away at a time when, in fact, he's just in his prime of exploding even to higher ambitions and achieve more and more successes by his diligence and his stubbornness too, which is quite an asset in the world of politics, in certain committees and fora. He was a gentleman who could get right into the weeds on individual cases, as was described by my two predecessors. And he was also capable of going to a grander scale, to a strategic level, to look at a policy that was influencing internationally, that was influencing nationally. And because he could get inside that and eloquently and with a good pen be able to project his ideas and his position, he got a lot done. And in fact, was surprising in how I considered him prolific in his engagements on the whole human rights spectrum. A few specifics that I think that, as Kyle mentioned, when I was looking for allies to create the All-Parliamentary Group on Genocide Prevention, I was already, I'd just come back from my research on child soldiers at Harvard, and we were moving into the idea of prevention with Kofi Annan having created a committee. I needed to find a place first to be able to talk and get support from, and I went directly to Migs to help me on that side of the house, with the responsibility to protect doctrine that reformed the whole idea of sovereignty, from being a sovereign state to the individual being sovereign. But it needed people to be able to get above the tactics of the building, of the complex, of the hill, and get into a higher plane of thought and debate, and to be able to move us beyond our borders and influence. And so one of the most loyal and committed and personally engaged individual was Paul, who understood that all parliamentary group meant all parties. And at one point we were having quite a time with Le Bloc, and he even assisted me in convincing them to join in, and we were able to speak with one voice. He wanted people to understand that there were arenas where human rights were massively being abused, and that at a strategic level, we could, as a leading middle power, produce a leadership role, and that the All-Parliamentary Group was going to help articulate that. And so to that, I am so very thankful. And also to Hélène Laverdiere, who is also a very strong supporter of our group. And I'm glad to see that it pursues today, and his work and his commitment was noticeable. I say noticeable because Paul wasn't a parliamentarian who delegated the face-to-face essential meetings to staff, which you so often would see. Yes, everybody's busy and so on, but he had this philosophy that instead of sending staff to find out and then come back, he would go and bring staff with him. He wanted to educate. He wanted to inform the younger crowd, the ones around him. He wanted to build in them that same feu sacré that he had for human beings, and the concept that all humans were equal, and that only through respect that we would be able to achieve, ultimately, peace and security. So I enjoyed that because I could get some good, solid face-to-face time with him, and he never reneged on being available and coming to meet us. He was quite supportive of the work when I was working with a number of colleagues on establish it through the Human Rights Committee in the Senate, two things. One, that we'd have a child commissioner, as the Brits have, for so many of the children who are coming in unaccompanied. So many of the various policies from different provinces and so on that just were not protecting children, and bringing the children factor from poverty to malnutrition to the Aboriginal children in particular and the abuses there. He felt that was a cause worthy of him to be committed to, as he did also when on the Aboriginal Committee, he fought to assist the Aboriginal women in regards to their rights, because they're not part of the Charter, and their desire not to go to be equal to the men, but in fact to go back to the old 19th century where the women had the infrastructure responsibilities and so on, and had enormous amount of power. That you didn't get many people interested in that domain. But then another arena that he was just peeved beyond description is whenever the term terrorist was being used, and we were being obtuse and absolutely the government not wanting to have anything to do with Omar Khadr, as an example, who was a child soldier. And he believed that he was first and foremost a child soldier, and abusing the term was in fact creating a scenario that was preventing other ex-child soldiers from coming out of that horrible recruitment process that was going on at the time internationally through ISIS and so on, and getting them home and to be treated fairly under the optional protocol of child rights that he actually knew about, which was most surprising, and quite happy I was. I think he struck a very strong chord with me personally, because he understood that there were a lot of walking wounded after these wars among the veterans, and that in particular the families were suffering immensely from those who were injured by operational stress injuries or PTSD. And he communicated with me at a level that few people were able to do, because he knew what to ask, he knew what to say, and he also diligently wanted that this complete disconnect of post-war be rectified. And what he was looking at was how do you spend billions on equipment and on ammunition and on training and so on, but when the injured veteran comes home, there is such a horrible penny pinching, even confrontational philosophy in Veterans Affairs, that pennies were given to assist those veterans from going to the level of self-destruction that too many have done. And so suicide prevention was very much part of the arguments that he and I often tried to pursue in both in the Green Chamber and the Red Chamber. I have not come to grips with the loss of a magnificent man, of a magnificent human who was well beyond himself. And in fact, one of the things that I used to mention when we met, either in my office or around, was, are you taking care of yourself, Paul? And when he finally was taken by the terrible, terrible disease, the sadness just came to the fore. And what I respected was his diligence in wanting to pull every file he could to a level of conclusion or a handover to someone so that the effort would not be lost. So great sadness still remains at that funny face coming into my office with curly hair and long hair sometimes, and sitting down so informally and saying, General, we got to sort this thing out together. And it was a real pleasure to do things and to work together. So thank you to the family, and condolences still. But so much love was with that guy, and we've felt it. And I, as a human, as many of you have felt, that he truly lived for humanity and not for himself. Thanks.
Thank you, General Dallaire, for those touching words that we all feel and share our loss with Paul's family today. I'd like to pass the floor to Hélène. Hélène served as an MP with the NDP from 2011-2019, and she was the official opposition critic for international development. So her work and the files she worked on were very close with Paul. So Hélène, I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Kyle. And yes, I'd like first to say hello to Paul's family and Paul's friends I know are in the room with us. I still remember vividly, as if it were yesterday, you were talking about 2011. I still remember the first caucus meeting, and, I had been elected out of the blue, and I was a bit lost, to say the least. And Paul and Kiavash coming towards me and introducing themselves. And at that time, I didn't yet know the kind of partnership we developed. And I didn't even yet know either how Paul would basically take me by the hand, show me how to navigate that strange thing that is a parliament, to push for issues we both believed in, issues like human rights, of course, and I'd say respect for human dignity, issues like peace. That's kind of important too. And these things permeated, I think, all the work. You can see a kind of common thread that is based in those kind of values throughout Paul's work. And I'm thinking, I know others have mentioned a lot of issues he's worked on, but I was trying to think, his work also on rape as a weapon of war, which is so important, his work on Boko Haram, on nuclear disarmament, on genocide prevention, of course, his work on conflict minerals, prevention. Here again, looking forwards, vision, and working on prevention. Working on General Dallaire was talking about child soldier, but working also on child labor. Those are all issues that he pushed through speeches, to meeting people, to getting more knowledgeable in the committee. He was quite something in committee meeting. I mean, he could push the other parties while always remaining respectful and a good colleague for everybody. And Tom talked also about how he had well thought on Israel Palestine, what he was proposing, suggesting, explaining was so well thought. And I couldn't help thinking about Syria. I think we were all moved about what was happening in Syria, and Paul devised a plan for Canada to receive refugees, and he basically offered the plan, saying, look, that's what I'm looking at, what the UN is asking, and what we can do, that's what we should do. And with insight, I'm sorry, I'm going to get political a little bit. I mean, his proposal was far better than the government's proposal. But anyhow, so we should have listened, they should have listened to him. So he was working very hard. He was able to go into the details, but also have the larger vision. And I think this is very, very important, and it's something that Otto mentions too, because it's not only looking at an issue from 20,000 feet above, but as I said, I think Paul believed in human dignity, so it means that he was also quite interested in specific cases, and not only interested, but very, very active and pushing. I mean, Alex mentioned Bashir Maktal, but there's Tarek Loubani, also Salek Maletpour, and so many people. And it made him, his belief, I think, in human dignity, in respect, made him a wonderful listener. And I think that's why he was also, I've never been one of his constituents, but probably a very good MP, because Paul was able to listen. That's so basic, sometimes difficult. It's not always easy. And when he dealt with foreign affairs, I remember sometimes he would go like that, because, he would take the time to sit with people who sometimes virulently disagreed with him, but he would take the time and do it and listen and try to explain his own point of view. So I think that as such a good listener, he was certainly an excellent MP. And I remember walking on the hill, with him, and people, some people from his riding. Of course, he had a little luxury to have the parliament in his own riding, never being far from home. But people stopping him and then telling me, oh, he's the best MP in the world, you know, and so the people in his riding loved him too. It was not just the politician in the House of Commons or in committee meeting rooms. He was also there on the ground with his fellow citizens in his riding. So it was really a huge privilege to work with somebody like Paul Dewar. And in fact, I think, you know, others have talked about hockey, and I think Paul and I had just one area of disagreement on an important issue. Would you believe it? Paul cheered for the Red Blacks. Well, he could have taken a team like the Alouettes, who are far more interesting. No, seriously, maybe you can't have it all. So we disagreed on football, but I've learned a lot from him. Paul was also somebody who was ready to learn from others, and that's important. And I think his memory lives on, and his memory lives on also his commitment lives on through his young youth action now group. And maybe if we want to remember him, we can make a little contribution to this fund. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hélène, for those touching comments. I think if I can take a moment to reflect on Paul, I think his background as a teacher and his engagement with youth is something that we all have to learn from. You know, he worked to get April 23rd, the birthday of Lester B. Pearson, recognized as the National Day for Action and Commemoration Against Mass Atrocity Crimes. And following that, every year he would be instrumental in having hundreds at first to 300-400 students gather at Carleton and have youth think about what we could do as a society to maintain social peace and harmony in Canada, but also what can we do abroad. And Paul really engaged with youth from the Ottawa area, and I think it's fantastic that he's seen, and his legacy is to work with youth and to equip the next generation of leaders. If I could make one last comment, we had the fortunate, my colleagues at Migs, we were very fortunate to work with Paul after he left politics. He still remained committed to these issues. He came with us to The Hague, where we brought together parliamentarians from around the world to look at how we could move the dial on fighting atrocities. That was work supported by Parliamentarians for Global Action and the Global Center for R2P. Paul was always, whenever we sent him an invite to come to Montreal or do an event on human rights, he would say yes right away. He spoke at our first Right City event, an annual conference on human rights to empower Canada to do more. So he really was an incredible person. There are some amazing comments, not a lot of questions, but comments coming through from people viewing this online. We have at least a couple hundred people following this from across the country and within Canada, but also internationally. And some of the comments are basically saying that we need to learn Paul's lessons more than ever because human rights are under threat. And I think Tom mentioned the case of the Rohingya and Myanmar. Some people have commented about China. But generally, we need to get more engaged. And I would just like to maybe ask our distinguished speakers, we have a few minutes left, if they could think about what could we do as a group of people, as Canadians, to honor Paul's memory and to move the dial for human rights. What can we take from him personally and do something today, 2 years after his passing? What message should we bring to Parliament Hill and to civil society and to the youth? Would anyone like to make a short comment on that?
I'll take a stab at giving one example, Kyle, if that's okay. And we've talked about big international issues. You just mentioned the Rohingya that I had raised, but of course the Uyghur in Western China, also an example. But, you know, sometimes it's closer to home. We've got to have a bit of an examination of conscience of what we do. For example, and there's no comparison in terms of the absolute numbers, but in the province of Quebec, legislation was passed recently we call it Bill 21 from the number it had when it was first posited. It's supposed to be about the separation of church and state, but it's also, if you read it, clearly targeted at one religious minority in particular, and in fact, not just Muslims, but Muslim women. There's a whole chapter in there that can only apply to them. So I do think it's also incumbent upon us to look at our own backyard and make sure that whenever we come to these discussions and debates, we come with clean hands. It's a disappointment to me that none of the leaders of any of the parties in Ottawa has been willing to take a strong stand against Bill 21. A lot of municipal leaders, mayors from large cities across Canada, and several provincial governments have expressed against it, but maybe it has to do with the fact that taking that sort of strong stand on these delicate issues can play into your numbers in Quebec. I do know something about that, but I also believe that if we're going to be able to talk to other people about their human rights records, well, we've got to stand up strongly with regard to the same human rights here at home.
Thank you, Tom. Who else would like to perhaps reflect or make a comment? Hélène, I see you. No. Alex, please, the floor is all yours.
Sure. Maybe two things quickly come to mind. One is, I guess, bigger picture. The other is more immediate. The bigger picture is, I think, just taking up Paul's example, and we've all referred to it in various ways, of making human rights your frame of reference, your guiding star for navigating the many challenges in our world. I think Tom's great example of the Israel-Palestine situation, which is fraught with sensitivities and politics and history, but keeping really focused, always remembering to, whatever the issue is, human rights offer the way forward. I think that's what Paul always felt and what he demonstrated, and make that your way. But the second is, and going back to those words I pulled out from his own message from 2 years ago, that sense of make your contribution. And of course, I know that there's all sorts of people online today who are already making enormous contributions. But let's make sure that we make that a daily commitment. There's always something you can do every single day, whether it's, write a letter, sign a petition. So maybe going forward and start today. Go online. Any of the issues that have been referenced here or other issues close to heart, global or, as Tom's reminding us, close to home. Look for where you can sign that petition, take some action, and make that a commitment going forward. I know in all sorts of ways, Paul was certainly a man of action every single day, and I think we all can be.
I'm trying to see whether an initiative around Parliament Hill or something that has got maybe a grander perspective. And my beliefs are that the youth of the world, who in so many countries blow the demographics completely away, where there are populations in some countries that over 50% are under 15, and we are seeing generational wars continuing throughout the world. And we don't see much conflict prevention, even though so many of these conflicts are based on the use of youth, of young people. And so there seems to me to be a link of moving peace and security for youth or children into the future, and a link back to Paul in some way that brings his name and his example and some of his writings, of course, to that effort, that very specific effort, very targeted, that as Tom mentioned, and so did Alex, and then he looked into the future. He believed in shaping the future and changing it, and not simply surviving it. And so the youth are the ones that are now engaged in that so much with the revolution of communications, there might be something of a link there that could be generated out of somewhere from the Hill or in the periphery of it through an institution or other. But I see his legacy very strong, attached to the advancement of peace and security of youth in the world, and ultimately achieving peace through the youth, the children.
Thank you, General Dallaire.
Yeah.
Migs will be working on that issue with you and other people join us today. Hélène, please.
Just to add that, yes, he did believe a lot in youth. First, he believed in his two wonderful boys. I hope they're well, and that's why this fund he created is about youth, and it's looking for the future. For me, it does explain, as General Dallaire was saying, both prevention and youth and the future, and looking towards the future. And the future is not easy right now for youth. Starting with climate change, it's not me who's going to have to live through the worst of it, and this pandemic, which is affecting them, affecting their future, their first budding years. So yeah, I think that speaking about youth represents really the values that Paul carried.
Thank you, Hélène. So we're right exactly at the time we said 1 hour to honor Paul and pay a tribute to him as human rights champion. I would like to, before we end, I have a message from Paul's family that I'd like to read out, but I'd like to thank all the speakers on behalf of Migs for taking time on a Saturday to join us. I'd like to thank Marie Lemanche and Jones and Ebley, who are digital fellow at Migs, for taking this and helping push this forward. I think it's very important to have this debate. But if I could read the message from Paul's family, it's from his wife Julia and his sons Nathaniel and Jordan. They say, "Thank you, Migs, for bringing us together to honor Paul. Migs is an organization that inspired Paul greatly. Thank you for your leadership and dedication to these issues. Thank you, Alex, Tom, Romeo, and Hélène, for sharing your stories and personal reflections. I know that his collaborations with each of you also inspired and encouraged him. Thank you for sharing your stories of Paul, many of which I had not heard. Honestly, there were too many stories to share around the dinner table. He would be pleased that we joined together, but would quickly want us to move past him and into the issues at hand. As an advocate, collaborator, and an educator, he would want us all to think about what we can do. Most of the youth initiatives we support through Youth Action Now address human rights issues. Of this, he would be proud. Thank you so much for honoring our dear Paul, Julia, Nathaniel, and Jordan." So thank you everyone for joining us. It was a great pleasure. We'll share this video online, and let's work and continue to uphold Paul's legacy as a human rights champion.
Well done. Well done.